The discussion that we're having this morning is on resilient futures, advancing sustainable livelihoods in India and Africa. Just for a bit of context, this is a topic that we at the Observer Research Foundation will be working more closely on for the next 3 years as part of a project that we have started. But it's what we have here is a room of fantastic speakers who actually work on this topic. So before we begin, allow me to do a bit of context setting for this conversation. And yes, after the initial interventions, we would really want to hear from all of you. So we want this to be an engaging session. Come in with your thoughts, come in with your provocations. So India is home to 1/6 of humanity and of course is key to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, while Africa, which accounts for about 18% of world population and also has the youngest population in the world, is also integral for achieving SDGs. Across India and Africa, millions of people depend on locally rooted livelihoods which are closely adapted to their distinct environments. These systems are being reshaped by increased economic fragility globally, by the pressures of climate change, by conflict, and also by geopolitical instability. Already progress on the SDGs is far too slow, and global poverty reduction has slowed to a near standstill this year. The global development agenda was fundamentally derailed by shifting geopolitical realities of 2025. However, in all of this, we find that large-scale government-led economic inclusion initiatives in India and in African countries can be effective, like India's National Rural Livelihoods Mission and Ethiopia's Productive Safety Net program. Both of these programs demonstrate how thoughtful programs which are backed by targeted investments can expand opportunities for the most vulnerable. These programs are grounded on principles of self-reliance, on collective action, community institutions, women's empowerment, and whole of society participation, and have been quite successful in strengthening local livelihoods. In today's session, we will explore how India and Africa can together promote sustainable livelihood models that protect both people and ecosystems. How can knowledge exchange between the two be deepened, as well as the role of technology and policy in innovations? I'm going to open this up for our first interventionist, which is going to be Uzumaka, who is Country Director, Management, Precision Development from Nigeria. So Uzumaka, I know that you've had some experience in working on the program Nigeria for Women, which also draws lessons or is based on the idea of collectivization of women for sustainable livelihoods, the way India's livelihood programs are. So what would you say have been the learnings from it, and how can such programs be scaled up?
Thank you. So some of the lessons I got from these programs and also my background at the Central Bank of Nigeria is you have to be intentional about the approaches to ensure that no one is left behind in the financial system, but more importantly, how do you bridge the digital divide? More often than not, there is an intentionality to do so much good that you forget the last mile, understanding that the whole is as strong as the parts. It's more important to having sustainable development and change in systems. One thing that came out of my work in these areas was the fact that although some of these groups, including like the village savings loans associations, they need to like regularize their system. So you have your credit history, you've seen your financial behaviors. How do you ensure that this is placed in a record that is acceptable by the banking system? The banks want to get their money back. So how do you show that people with goodwill and good financial behaviors in terms of the social behavioral learnings around the self-help groups eventually are able to access the financial markets and get credits like other people have access to? Another thing that stood out here is policy. So there has to be an entire financial architecture that allows newcomers, but more importantly, ensure that credit is recognized as a livelihood for these people. So how do you make sure that the system accommodates the people that actually want to invest positively, but also reap economic benefits irrespective of where they're from, their tribes, or their affiliation. So on a system that is based on equity and equality. A third component I've seen around this work and for sustainability is the intention around policies. People do not or sometimes underestimate how much policies influence processes, people, profit, and even the planet as we look at the bigger picture. So what are the policies currently in the Nigerian government that ensure that there's regulatory protection and also customary rules that sometimes make it difficult to have people better assess the financial incentives that are embedded in the system? For instance, women did not have bank accounts in Nigeria without male consent until 50 years ago. I cannot inherit a land from my father, but my brothers can. So there are still governances, local rules, and institutions that makes it impossible to put you at a level playing field. And how do we better use our voices to ensure that the policies and the processes we want to protect not just the financial institution, but other institutions that better serve women? A component of my work and something that I've taught has been relevant to sustainability has been the role of security in fragile conflict-affected settings. So in Nigeria, the Northeast is predominantly one of fragility, and something I've seen there is people don't even want to go to banks, and where there are self-help groups in the areas, women can't meet safely. So thinking about a robust architectural system for security and safety where people feel safe not just to go to farms, but also go to markets and feel safe enough to put their money in a bank and know that when they're relocated from their villages, a representative of another bank in another state, in another city where they're relocated to will ensure that they still have access to their funds. And that's a trust in the financial system that some people do not have in fragile conflict-affected settings. Again, so many lessons from India and the good work that has been done there around self-help groups. But institutions actually make people behave differently, and understanding the realities and nuances in your own situation makes you better adapt to your realities and fit for purpose. So around sustainability, these are the big arcing points that I think are relevant, and these are ways I think the governments can ensure they are sustainable. Again, something India has done so well is the exponential growth. And everyone is thinking of how to adopt that model. But you have to look at the other things India has gotten right. So the institutions, the infrastructure system, the role of technology, and how that has helped people to do better, to do faster, and to do longer, what could have not been done with technology. So I think those are just areas that will work around sustainability, but more importantly, long-term gains that can be preserved. Again, like Metu said yesterday, how do you safeguard what you already have? So I think there's a few ways I've thought about this and what's relevant to this conversation.
Thank you. That's actually all very useful. You mentioned the challenges around access to credit, the role of security, which is critical here. The one thing that I wanted to bring up was that even in India and the success of self-help groups has actually been an iterative process. It has taken decades to get there. They started somewhere in the 80s and 90s and have built up. And one of the learnings has also been that it is not just a centralized national government role, but that the role of states in driving these programs is very important. So when you look at Nigeria, would you say that it has been more centralized, top-down, and or have states taken a lead? And is that possible?
So, you know, in Nigeria, it is currently sponsored by the World Bank. So the World Bank tends to be very subnational to ensure that the states are carried along. I would say this, even the states need to take ownership. and ownership in the sense of not everything has come back to the capital, but how to domesticate it to better serve them. So a self-help group in Newi, Anambra State is going to be totally different from a self-help group in Meduguri in Borno State. Two different cultures, peoples, how they relate, the ideas around savings historically, the ideas of some cultures where people do not ask for help, some cultures are more egalitarian, some cultures are more forward in terms of equity, equality, and what that means for human dignity, and how agency is accepted and assessed in different states. So depending on the state in Nigeria, the self-help groups look very different. One thing I would say it's relevant is the push at the central, right? What are the systems, what are the processes, what are the profits or the possibilities being pushed out from the center for the states to better assess these opportunities and better organize. Again, you can't take out the reality of individual states. So these are quite different, but I think something that has stood better is the intention of like the Central Bank of Nigeria to match these funds from the World Bank and how the states are able to better argue for more opportunities. I think those are the differences we've seen, where some states are very forward, more literate, more intentional about asking for more and not stopping at where they've gotten. So truly very different for various states, but we've seen progress around areas where they are more forward-thinking, less cultural, and more intentional about assessing the global markets.
All right. Let's bring Julia Wanjiru Nikima in now. She's policy analyst at South Africa project lead at Egypt Focal Point. Also the Clean Energy Finance and Investment Mobilization lead at OECD. Did I get that right? Yes. Okay. So Julia, Uzumaka just spoke about the aspect of security, the other disruption to sustainable livelihoods has been around climate, and a big one at that. And of course, your work lies at the intersection of food security and climate resilience in Africa. So, how do you think food systems can be strengthened to withstand shocks and build livelihoods?
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I hope you're all fit for a long day, and thanks for the invitation. My first reaction, if I may, when I saw the session title is we always take for granted, it's pretty obvious, but we talk Africa, and I think it's important to keep in mind that we talk about 54 different countries, and I'm glad that my colleague from Nigeria just talked about the differences even within a single country. So whatever I say, you really need to take it against the caveat that there is nothing such like Africa as an example. I think it's a very important reminder. Africa is diverse. When we talk about food systems, at the OECD we like triple challenges. And just to recall for everyone that food systems face, first of all, the challenge to produce food and nutrition, to ensure food and nutrition security for people. And that's not just producing food, but also to ensure access to food that is related to security challenges, to a healthy diet, and to do that over time. Then the second big role is, of course, ensuring livelihoods. And here to keep in mind that on average, still 60% of African people depend on rural livelihood, not necessarily rural, but on agricultural activity at some point. And the last challenge is related to your question, is to ensure environmental sustainability and to be able to respond to climate shocks. So we need to face that triple challenge. And to answer your question about how can we strengthen livelihoods in the face of climate change, the first initiative that came into my mind was led in the Sahel and West Africa region, started over a decade ago. Maybe some of you may be familiar with the Global Alliance for Resilience. It was an EU initiative at the time. The starting point was that every year in that region comes in humanitarian aid, where we count the number of people who grow hungry during the lean season. And it's very costly, and the idea was simply to build resilience to help these farmers to get through the lean season without necessarily depending 100% on external support. So they built a lot of bottom-up support at the time, did a lot of policy dialogue activities. It took a long time, but all these states within ECOWAS region at the time, 15 countries, plus Mauritania and Chad, came up with national resilience priorities. And development partners who wanted to invest into that had the opportunity, at least, to invest into nationally owned projects that contributed to enforcing and strengthening resilience in that area. And I think that was a quite, I don't say it was perfect, but I think it was a quite amazing starting point because it raised awareness. And if you don't have awareness, you can't even start solving the problem. I think that's a first important lesson. The second vehicle that I would like to highlight is the NDCs. All African countries do have NDCs. Only a few submitted the new generation, the Dutch 3 NDCs. However, they're all more or less built in the same way. We have a focus on climate mitigation, adaptation, and means of implementation. Very much familiar with the one of Egypt. It has a long list of projects focusing on strengthening climate resilience in the agricultural sector. Virtually all projects focus on either agriculture or water. And again, this is an opportunity to have country ownership and to invest in existing programs. I think in terms of action, obviously, how can we strengthen climate resilience? All comes to mind climate smart agriculture, everything related to improving water management, soil conservation techniques. I think one thing that is really undervalued at the moment is investment in insurance. African farmers do lack protection against climate hazards. And another point I'd like to add is capitalizing on local knowledge. I think that's something that is not looked at enough at the moment. That is about the what. Somebody yesterday in the opening session spoke about water, and water would be the new crisis. And I totally agree. And here I would like to kindly recall that for most African economies, water is not a physical scarcity, but a governance issue. And I think here again, we need to recenter the focus on addressing governance issues. And related to that, I'm joyful that we have a purely female panel, and I think we will talk about that later. Gender is, of course, a huge driver to ensure that livelihoods can get strengthened. I get to my last point, domestic resource mobilization. I talked about AGIR, which is an initial initiative led by the EU. I talked about the NDCs, with again, you have opportunity to tap into international climate finance, but I do believe that the African countries have their own responsibility. And over 2 decades ago in Maputo, in 2003, they committed to spend at least 10% of public budgets into the agricultural sector. And if you look at the outcome, none of the 54 countries actually fulfilled that commitment. There were some that managed to spend 10% one year or another, but never in a continuous way. And that's, of course, a huge problem because agriculture remains heavily underfunded on the African continent. To give an idea, I checked the numbers. On average, it's around 4 to 6%. If you compare that to the European Union Common Agriculture Policy, they spend up to 38%. And that's, of course, due to the fact that you have a strong lobby, which you don't have. And brings me to the last point. I think everything you could do is to strengthen agricultural organizations and bottom-up approaches in African countries. That would greatly help, actually, to support a stronger push towards agriculture investment. I'll stop here, and just to finish the India question, I think India has a role to play, and we talked about that yesterday. In terms of technology transfer, it's well known that irrigation techniques are one of the most developed in the world. I think there's a lot of opportunity for win-win solutions and investment opportunities. I don't know what happened to the Africa-India summit. Maybe there's opportunity to revive that. I think there's a lot of ideas out that could help capitalize on South-South cooperation here.
I have a very quick follow-up, if you can tackle that in under 30 seconds or take a minute. Yeah. But considering that you're representing OECD and the whole conversation around Western donors in retreat, and you talked about resource mobilization, all of that requires funding. There have been major ODA cuts all of this year. I'm not even going near US shutting down development agencies, but also all of the traditional donors have, including where you come from. When you contextualize this for Africa, what are the solutions? What are the solutions? Should Africa be looking at other sources of funding and
Yes, I totally agree. The situation from the development partners' perspective side looks pretty there. I think a key issue is also related to the security situation, that a lot of the money is being pulled into security rather to more sustainable actions. Of course, African countries, that was my last point, need to be able to mobilize domestic resources and private sector finance much more strongly than in the past. I think the whole discussion on ODA is quite a decade-long discussion. How can aid become more effective, etc.? I don't want to get really into that. DCD, our corporation, we count the numbers. We have detailed statistics about financial flows getting into each African country. And I think Africa's share is not getting larger. I think there is some attention to help the least developed countries, but that won't fly. So definitely I agree with you. The solutions lie also mainly within the African continent, and you need to go for investment.
I'm going to turn to you, Sivive Malana, who is a researcher at South Center for Inequality Studies, University of Witwatersrand, South Africa. You have looked at the contributions of female informal workers from an ecological perspective. When you think about the role of social policy and how it can be designed better or adapt to meet the evolving needs of women in the informal economy, what would you say?
Thank you. Thank you to our hosts. Deeply honored to be part of this conversation at such a critical time. I did look at the questions that you sent us in advance, and I think my responses might have changed from the conversation that we were a part of yesterday. I think, you know, as an academic, it's always difficult to cut the long story short. But I think a couple of things that stood out to me in terms of yesterday's conversation, and I think it might have been Abdel that made this as one of her final interventions, was around how the current model doesn't fit our kind of aspirations as the kind of global population, but also in terms of the SDG goals. And I think in thinking about the informal sector in particular, a lot of this could just be attributed to the fact that it is by design, right? So when you talk about social policies and how they can better support informal workers, the reality is that the current social policies that we have not been designed based on, one, the kind of the experiences of the majority of countries in the global south, but they've also been designed with a particular type of worker which is based on this kind of Fordist welfare kind of state situation, in which the assumption is that countries have a large population of formalized workers and kind of standard jobs with social protections. And this is not the case. If you kind of look at the facts in terms of the contributions of informal workers, we know that more than 60% of the world's population of workers globally is in the informal sector. And particularly for African countries, for India, or for countries across the global south, this can go upwards to 80% upwards, right? And what this means then, for those who aren't kind of familiar with the technical definition of informality, is that these are workers who lack kind of legal and social protections. But they're also, based on our kind of recent global health and economic crisis, are workers who tend to kind of be excluded even in terms of the kind of state support, right? We saw, I think, only kind of 40%, I believe, of the world's population during COVID did not have access to healthcare. And so then what does that mean in the context of a worsening climate crisis? Is that a lot of these people will also be not protected. So WIGO's done a lot of work in terms of looking at what the risks for workers in kind of urban informal sectors. And of course, there's research that shows kind of the health and occupational risks that are related to the climate crisis within kind of the urban informal sectors. But we also know that generally the data that shows even for agricultural informal workers, kind of the loss of working hours, the exposure to kind of health risks, the displacement at a community level, and then who has to subsidize this. And if I return to the first comment around what kind of economic model that we're functioning in, to also, in some ways, try to answer Samira's question around the principles that we would like then to imagine for kind of a world that would be more kind of equitable and just and sustainable, is to kind of just be aware of the fact that the economic model that we're dealing with has been based on exploitation, domination, and oppression, right? And what would be the alternative to that would have to take account of how, even in our own communities, and particularly from the African case, how capitalism or the expansion of capitalism and colonialism globally has even transformed how we understand and value work, right? And if we're not then funding or supporting social policies for the informal sector, there is an expectation that this work is still going to be done, right? So women and communities in the informal sector indirectly subsidizes this kind of project that is disadvantaging the majority of the world. And so in thinking about then to your answer as well, but also trying to respond to kind of the values and the principles that an alternative might look like, is one that is obviously people-focused, one that values kind of social and ecological reproduction, that values the work of women and communities, and also supports it. So we can't get social policies if we also don't have kind of feminist macroeconomic policies and fiscal policies to support this. But that's also based on the fact that we understand that in our context where we have high levels of unemployment, a lot of people will not necessarily be covered through job-based social protections, right? But this is what is actually creating resilience and sustainability, right? If there's no incomes and growth does not filter down to the communities, people are still surviving somehow, right? And we need to support that through our fiscal policies. So then to kind of wrap up then, it is to say that, yes, there's a lot of work that's been done in trying to document what the experiences of informal workers, experiences of countries in the global south is in regards to the climate crisis, and more of that needs to be done. But as I say, organizations like Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing, or WeGo, as some of you might have heard of, has done work, as I say, with market traders, with home-based workers, where we've seen kind of the health and occupational risks that are tied to the climate crisis. But more of that documentation is required, more of that sharing of best practices from around the world. There's some great cases within kind of Latin America and other countries. But also understanding, as I say, if we're saying that this kind of model has basically relied on the unpaid and undervalued work of communities and women in the informal economy, is to actually fund this through the state, but also through everyone who's actually benefiting from this labor indirectly, and to actually kind of value this work and put it in the kind of fiscal policies. But yes, I think generally, I think it is a kind of a restructuring around our kind of our thinking, around our values, so that we're able to then create this kind of alternative world that recognizes this work, but also recognizes that it really is up to these kinds of policies for the future of the planet and for the world, as we heard from yesterday's conversation. But I'll stop there, yeah.
Thank you. You've actually already answered the question that I had, which was on, I think what you underlined was that social policies have been defined by the North. And of course, that does not reflect the reality of the global South, where the majority of workers are informal. I did want to ask you of, since this is a learning exchange roundtable, examples to draw from, but you mentioned some. Would you add anything else by any country from Africa, even South Africa, to protect social workers?
You know, I think and this isn't a bias because I'm South African, but there has been some studies in terms of how kind of social grants have actually improved, I guess, the statistics around kind of poverty. Things are worsening. And I do say, I think with the Latin American case as well, social securities that are also kind of not necessarily contributory. I think one thing from my work recently that's been around tax, and since we were just talking about domestic revenue mobilization, is that there's been a recent interest in, of course, the informal sector since the COVID pandemic. And a lot of this is based on this idea that we can, increase revenues in our countries through the informal sector, because the informal sector is this hidden gold mine. Whereas the data shows that, of course, these are workers who earn very low wages, but they're also contributing, right? So we're working on the assumption that informal workers do not contribute to taxes, because we're also looking at this as kind of income taxes. But at a local level, these are people that are contributing. And I think if you look at it in that way, then there's an expectation that if you say that people are paying taxes for the common good, and that there's a responsibility, but also an expectation of what should be received, that this should also be something that is covered. Right now, we see in our markets that workers don't have access to ecological services, they don't have access to water, they don't have access to electricity. And this is based on these people are not contributing. But that is not the reality that we've seen in our data. And I think then if we're thinking about social policies, that we should actually take into account the full contributions of informal workers, which might not necessarily be related to kind of our mainstream kind of measurements of progress, such as GDP or contributions based on income. Yes.
Okay. That actually brings me to the segue for Priscilla Gatone, who's fellow Africa Comm from Kenya. You've worked extensively on microfinance, on entrepreneurship, skilling and training at the grassroots level. Based on what Priscilla just, what Sivive just mentioned about informal workers and their contribution. We also are working in an environment in the global political economy where the need for reskilling is very high and economies are changing rapidly. So how do we ensure that workers are actually equipped with future-ready skills, all workers and especially women?
Okay, thank you so much. I want to make it very easy for us to understand. I work mostly on TVET, so for people who don't know about TVET, TVET is the Technical and Vocational Education and Training. And basically the work that we do is to understand what are the barriers that women are facing when it comes to skill development. So you talked about informal sector, and the other colleague talked about gender and the issues that surround us. And I really want to get into the future of work. So when we talk about the future of work, what comes to mind? Yeah? So there's AI, there's green technology, there is issues to talk on how more people are going to lose jobs, etc. But then when it comes to the future of work, do we really sit to understand what the data says? So I want to really talk about the data that we have currently. So if you look at the World Economic Forum in 2023, they mentioned that 44% of work is going to be disrupted by AI. Then we're talking of 30 million jobs are going to be created through green technology. And at the same time, we're talking about AI is going to affect almost 86% of work. And it has around 4.6 trillion market value. So when you think about the future of work, these are like big words that don't really translate to a common person, which we call in Kenya hustler person, someone who is me and you. Like, how does this translate to us? So what is the data when it comes to women economic development and skill development? So if you think about it, a third of the global economy, that is 30% or so of women, are not in education, they're not in training, and they're not in employment. So that has to sink in. basically. And why are they not there? Because they lack literacy and foundational skills. So these are about people cannot read, people cannot be able to calculate, do basic arithmetics, and yet we are talking about AI. Do you see the disconnect? So that is one of the factors that you have to think about. Then the other thing, we look at the issue of AI. So it's only 22% of women who have AI skills, 22% professionals. And LinkedIn did a very interesting survey in 2024, and they looked at the number of women who have green skills. So maybe by checking around the room, how many of you have a green skill? What is a green skill? That is a good point, because nobody even knows what a green skill is. But basically, when we talk about the data, that is what women are asking. What is a green skill? Do I even have it? Should I have it? Is it dangerous for me? And what we see is the LinkedIn report said that if you look at
What
the number...
is the green skill? You might have to tell us.
I want to give it like to the last point so that you can go like, aha, you know. But basically, if the LinkedIn report was talking about, if you take the men who have green skills, it's 1 out of 6 men have a green skill. And then 1 out of 10 women have a green skill. So basically in a room of 10 women, 9 of them have no single green skill. But what is a green skill? So these are green skills are skills that relate to what we talk about climate change, talk about the transition into the green world. So this is aspects to do with agriculture, water, energy, waste management, and conservation, but how are they changing to the technological aspect of the future of work. So that's a green skill. Like, are you able to, for example, can you work on irrigation schemes? Are you able to do hydroponics farming? Do you have any opportunities to work on solar installation? Are you aware of upcycling? Are you able to take your old garment like jeans and make it into a bag? Upcycling. So these are some of the requirements that are needed into the world today that most of us are not doing and we don't have access to. And then I want to talk about another data. It's about the digital divide. We have around 90%, and this was a UNICEF report last year, 90% of girls and women from low-income countries have no access to data or connectivity, so they stay offline. And yet we're talking about the future being green, the future being AI, and the future being very brilliant. So we see there's a huge disconnect, and the question is, how can we address these issues when it comes to women? And we know a lot of women face a lot of challenges. So when I work on TVET, we are at the bottom of the skill development. We talk about climate change, we talk about, my colleague talked about NDCs. We see that when you talk about nationally determined contributions, every country has these steps that they want to achieve when it comes to climate change. But do they have a very actionable strategy when it comes to skill development? So we see that a lot of industries that contribute to, for example, the climate effects are governed by people, are implemented by people who are vocationally trained. So we're talking about plumbers, we're talking about typical electricians, etc. These are the people who are contributing, and agriculture, especially for women. They're the people who are contributing to the biggest challenges that we're seeing in climate change, but they're not trained on how they can actually affect issues. So when you think about this, we have to address these challenges that I just mentioned. We talk about basic foundational skills. So for you to be able to upskill and reskill, you have to be able to understand that we are at different levels globally in terms of women development and skill development, especially in African context. So foundational skills, how do you ensure this? So when you talk about support systems that you were talking about earlier, we have foundational skills come in. So you have to make livelihood training that foundational skills are part of the livelihood training. So it starts with combining entrepreneurship and something else like hydroponics, combining basic reading and counting and understanding the economic infrastructure with something else like climate change activities. That is the first aspect that we need to have. Then it's about looking at it from an ecosystem approach, because there's no woman who is going to learn about a skill or upskill when they don't have food. So it's about understanding how can the bigger ecosystem, safety nets, support system, active labor market forces be applied by the government and different partners to ensure that when women go to class to learn something new, they don't miss out on the food for the day. Can we provide that for that opportunity? Challenges like childcare. Who is going to be taking care of children at home when I go for this training? Issues with security and mobility. Not everyone is able to go to the center that you want to do this training in. How can you ensure that you address these challenges? So that is the next thing. Then it's about what we talked about, digitalization and green skills. So what are these green skills? How can they be applied? Individually, we talked about the big sectors that we can look into and ensure that this is done. So when it comes to green skills, it's not just about agriculture that you grow. We know from Africa we have a lot of agriculture, subsistence, growth of the things that we do. We are from Africa, we know what we've done and our parents have been working on. But now what is happening is about value addition. How can you train more women? How can they bring value into these agricultural practices? How can they come up with last mile of, for example, processing? Yogurt has been very common. It's about milling. It's about examples of now what we're talking about, garment making. How can we ensure that women are adding value to these practices and they understand entrepreneurship so that they can build resilience and be able to connect whatever they're learning into livelihoods? It's not just about learning something, but being able to apply. And then the digital divide, there's so many models that we see in terms of people who have no access to digital tools, for example, no infrastructure for countries who have no access to electricity, etc. But there's still other opportunities. Remember, during COVID, for people who are in education sector, we remember that our children were learning from radio and TV. There were programs on that. So there's still opportunities for people to learn, even if it's not through internet or through modalities like having phones, etc. We've seen a lot of TVET opportunities where we see mobile training. So there are vehicles moving around, and this is very common even in developed countries. We have like a SAP cafe. They move around teaching digital skills to different cohorts. They just get some young people to come into this moving vehicle. They get to learn, and the next time is moved to another village. So there are so many modalities in which we can apply to ensure that skilling and upskilling is done. And when you think about, don't think about women in the rural areas, think about yourselves, because the future is coming, change has come. We've seen data in US where graduates are not able to get jobs. We've seen people who are engineers and data analysts, they are not getting jobs. So you'll all come back to me on TVET, because if you look around the room, everything that has been done by hands is still not going to go away, at least not yet. We're still going to need carpenters, we're not going to need people who are doing upholstery, carpet. Look around you, anything that can be done. So the question is, do you have the skill, a technical skill that cannot be changed easily by this advancement? And it's going to be your solution for resilience and being able to bounce back easily when we see a lot of disruption.
Okay, that was actually very useful because, as you said, in all this talk about future of work and AI, we do forget that foundational skills are essential and also missing for large communities in India and in Africa. You talked about digital skills, and that brings me to Lynette Kwamboka, who is Director, Data and Digital Transformation, Data Sciences at Kenya. You have been working, of course, on data and digital transformation. On the one hand, we have the aspect of digital divides. We also know that AI, which can deepen those divides, but it also has the potential for addressing at scale some of the big problems around education, around health, around finance access in developing countries. So how do you sort of balance both of those?
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. I would like to pick up from where Priscilla left and advance it a little bit about thinking of the future of the workforce, not just the future of work. The focus on the future of work tends to focus more on what's the private sector thinking, what's NVIDIA thinking, what's Google thinking, Microsoft. But then we need to start changing that into what should governments be thinking about when it comes to workers, like you and I. And what is the workforce of the future going to look like? And how can they adapt to what the work of the future is going to look like? I'll start off by drawing comparisons between India and Africa, for example. The population of India is about 1.45 billion people. The population of Africa as a continent is about 1.5 billion people. But then when we have conversations, especially the AI conversation, AI is now centered in the US, in China, and there's a lot of trickle down that is happening in India because India has, the second largest population of AI users in the world. But then when it comes to Africa, we think about it as Kenya, South Africa, Nigeria, that division, devolving Africa then reduces Africa's power of also negotiating when it comes to AI. Think about, chips and skills and tools that are available for, the future of work when we're thinking about skilling and reskilling. A lot of this is inaccessible to, to Africa. Think about the, war that is happening between the US and the technological war, at least, the US and China. And now think about a country, for instance, where I come from, Kenya, that has about 60 million people. What level of negotiation can we actually have? So starting at that very macro level in terms of what can we negotiate for as, Africa, as India, and are we able to have a common front, really, to be able to have these negotiations. But then coming down, again, to what Priscilla said and what my fellow panelists have also mentioned, when it comes to skills are very, very important. AI is going to come, is already here, it's already disrupting jobs. When you hear, the big multinationals, firing 30,000 people, can you imagine in one day 30,000 people are just told your keycard access is revoked? Now think about what that population would do in an African country, in a single country, and the kind of contribution that they would have, to the economy. We have become consumers of what is produced, and by, so doing, to what, she said, then we rely on global policies. It's what has been done up there, and when it trickles down, we will use it. But we need to have a conversation around the policies that happen and kind of the last mile parts of the policies. Countries in Africa, develop policies in two ways. One is if, the top leadership is interested in something, they come up with a policy that is favorable. And two is if a donor is interested in something, then they force the country to come up with a policy that is favorable to do that. A lot of the ways and the initiatives we look at skills in Africa, we look at technology in Africa, or at least in African countries, is very much determined by the developing world. And a lot of it is not by our governments and by the people. When you thinking about inclusion of people in the AI space, in the computing or digital space, a lot of these are coming from an interest that is external to the people. And when that happens, then you don't have a good grasp of what this is. You come up with a policy. A few weeks ago, Kenyans were making a lot of fun that we've become a graveyard of documents. But that last mile end of implementation, we can come up with a good policy around skills. We can come up with a good policy around, use of technology. But because then the implementation part does not happen, you find that there are all these nice, policies, but then no one is really benefiting from this. A second issue becomes when you subdivide, for instance, the African continent into very small units, then we don't have a big enough population that makes business or economic sense for us to be able to get the right kinds of investments going. A few weeks ago, the president of Kenya mentioned a few years ago they negotiated for Microsoft to build a green data center in Kenya using geothermal energy, and we know how hot data centers are right now. Only to notice that we produce about 20% of the kind of energy that is needed to actually run a data center as a country. not, as a country, the amount of energy that we produce cannot even run. So you would need to shut down, the entire country, half the country, to be able to run a data center. But then we have Strive from Cassava Technologies in the south. We have minerals coming from Congo. We have very good skills in Kenya. We have, Egypt that is very good in robotics and manufacturing. We have, the West that is, very fantastic in innovation. What if we looked at technology and innovation and digital transformation from that point, right? You could think about, the US. A lot of the innovation happens in Silicon Valley, but then when you think about data centers, you're going to Virginia. When you're thinking about something else, you're going to a different state. So that a single country is not focused on trying to do everything, because even with that, by the time someone in a rural village is getting that service, it's very many levels down. And then we have something called the Universal Service Fund that tries to then, bridge that divide, trying to get people to pay so that people in the rural villages are getting, the services that they should get. But we also have things like load shedding. Think of, what happens when you decide to load shed. You look at the economically viable locations in a country, to be able to do that. So how do we make sure that we are bringing everyone on board? But then very finally, one of the things, of course, I'm sure a lot of us, even if you're not technologists, have heard that Steve Jobs said, build it and they will come. Digital public infrastructure and why that is also important when you're thinking about, artificial intelligence. We like to talk about, the rural communities versus the urban communities as these two very different populations. But then we have seen that very illiterate people have bought mobile phones because with a mobile phone, they have access to mobile money, technologies. We have seen motorbike drivers in the gig economy buying smartphones because that is how then they get to afford, to be on, to get employed, to do deliveries and to get their livelihoods. So how do we get communities involved in this process? Sometimes we over-politicize, if that's a word, the entire processes. But then when you look at the things that have worked, no one taught anyone how to use Facebook, but somehow, billions of us went on Facebook. No one taught us how to use, in the Kenyan case, M-Pesa, but then, if you tell your mother in the village that you're going to send money, they will get a phone. And someone made a joke and said, my grandmother, who doesn't even know how to read, looked at the amount and said, but you did not add the transaction fees, to the transaction, right? Who taught them how to do that? But it's because there was the demand. So they forced themselves to be able to do that. So this is a challenge for us to produce things that people actually need. And when you do that, sometimes you don't even need policies, but you need policies to create the safe, guidelines and safeguards around exploitations and overuse by the private sector. But then when you build things that people actually need, be them, AI, green skills or, digital transformation, they will find a way of using them and they will find a way of being included in the economy.
Thank you, Lynette. We'll now move to our last intervention. Meshta, you are the entrepreneur in this group. Meshta Khalid is founder EcoBees Tunisia. Lynette just talked about how technology has also broken the divides between rural, urban, and how access can actually just enable uptake. When you look at entrepreneurship, as someone working on social impact, how do you think governments and development programs can better support local entrepreneurs in scaling community-driven enterprises?
So, hello everyone. So, as a perspective from a serial entrepreneur working on 3 different ventures, 2 in the green space and 1 in the medical space. I know one thing, that is startups and enterprises don't fail because they have weak ideas or weak talents in our region, but actually they fail because they don't fit into a system that are not built for them. So actually they are not there for them to grow. So basically here is the part where organizations and governments can involve and transform that. So basically, through my experience working on IoT and AI and all of that, integrating into rural areas, working with beekeepers, farmers, artisans, women, and different areas, all these people are able to adapt into these technologies and to work with entrepreneurs and be themselves the entrepreneurs. Actually, when it's well supported and well appointed to them and co-created with them, which is the most important thing. So basically here, the thing that is, there are lots of opportunities for entrepreneurs, but it's divided into multiple things that are not needed actually by them. So what is really needed is a long-term technical assistant for them to live, patient capital, and actually to help them to grow, not actually as a charity work, but actually for them to create jobs, because entrepreneurs are job creators, and also we keep culture. It's also like merging all of this, innovation, culture, and innovation to do climate resilient activities and to support these people around us. Basically, all of these is like have a very good impact into different scenarios of Africa and also India. But actually, talking about green skills, women in Tunisia and people in general have shifted since COVID into this. So basically, the government now is trying to support them, but it's not like targeted into their needs. So basically this is like the cap that it's needed to be done by the governments. But also another thing is localizing the initiatives. It's actually either, for us in Tunisia, it's either in Tunis or the capital, and that's not where like a lot of entrepreneurs and people that we work with are. So basically being decentralized in different areas actually will be better. So another thing is actually AI and all of the tech can be adapted for rural places and people to adapt. Like you talked about adapting to getting a phone to do that. So basically, when we first entered the beekeeping industry to detect data, and for them that was like, what is IoT? How can I use AI to detect a bee flying? So that's new to them. So basically, what we did is actually simplifying technology and data for people to access that. And simplifying this data, and to have that, we need the government to work with us on the data sets and to share and support these trainings. So basically it was for us, like the last 3 years, adapting these farmers into these technologies was never been easier, and it's shocking for us because we first assumed that they will not adapt into this situation, but basically they needed that. And why I started this, because my family actually lost plus than 500 hives in the northern of Tunisia because of fires happened in 2022. Actually, I am from the community. So basically helping this, being entrepreneurs from the community itself and building with it to create from their exact needs is the key to integrate technology, to work with governments, and to transform that. And actually now we are working with the army in Tunisia to adapt, to put the IoT devices into trees and forests to detect fires that are happened, and we lost the hives. So basically it's like the full ecosystem that we work in EcoBees. And actually to finish is just the co-creation is the key to transform, and we don't need the support, but we need the translation. Because in Africa, it's always been about translation into what we actually need and what we actually adapt. So.
Thank you for that. I actually have follow-up questions, but I'm also conscious of the time and that we need to open this up. And I see a lot of faces and a lot of people here who actually could contribute. So I'll start with this side of the room and put your hand up, and I'll try and work my way like this around the room. Shama, you want to go first?
Hi, my question is to Uzma.
Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Dr. Shama
It
Mohammed,
can be interventions, questions.
national spokesperson of the Congress Party from India. My question is to Uzmaka. You spoke about how they have to, people don't go to the banks because of security issues. All right? And you also spoke about technology. My question to you, maybe I digress a bit, but when we hear from India about Nigeria is about recently abductions of girls from schools. If you're not able to keep your most vulnerable safe, how do you expect do you expect the rest to be safe, in terms of this? And why isn't the Nigerian government not using technology for their intelligence to keep these girls safer? I fail to understand that this has been happening repeatedly. It's not something which happened this year. It's been happening repeatedly. And why not use technology to keep them safe? Why is no punishment, conviction? What are they doing to prevent this? Because once you have your most vulnerable safe, is then when you can go to banking and the rest of it. Thank you.
All right. We'll come back to that. Yes.
Tirthankar from WRI. So, yes, slightly related, but on a larger issue is that it ultimately boils down to how you actually meet your development goals, right? So and over there, the role of energy becomes very important. Like, how do you actually provide a reliable, affordable energy? So I'm not even talking about clean or brown or just the electrons. When you put the electrons in the line, they don't have any color. So I think over there, there is a scope for providing reliable energy with the DRE systems and all of those. And in that context, data plays a major role. Like, where do you put up the most efficient solar panels and thereby attract private investment or any kind of funding for that? Because investment only flows when there is a reliability of production of energy units and that can be anywhere. Like this, it links back to the development, because there are studies which shows that, again, it's not the Western model we need to follow, because we do precisely believe that the per capita energy consumption to meet at least 0.7 HDI doesn't necessarily be the European levels of energy consumption. It can be the other levels, which can be much lower, because we can leapfrog it. So I think there is a role of energy to actually also to provide, and there is intertwined, it is the data, which is like it can be used, and the alternative sources of data, because today you have all the GIS based information and all. We are not possibly optimizing their power to actually make decisions.
You can come in, but quickly. Yes.
Okay, I'm another academic, so I don't know if I can be quick. My name is Dr. Catherine Gitao from Kenya. So I became very curious as Priscilla told us about the green skills. So I wanted to do a mini poll. Can we raise our hands in this room? I think we're about 50, to see if we have the right proportion of green skills. And maybe Lynette can help us do a quick count since she's the data scientist. 18%. So we're doing pretty well. We're a privileged group. Okay, thank you for that. So my question is, how can women step up to the plate? And it's for all the panelists, because I believe even though women are doing badly off on the whole, as Priscilla has told us, we have a very privileged group here of women. And what should each of us be doing to bring change? That's it. I hope I wasn't long.
This is Christiane Safak. I'm Chief of Social Policy in UNICEF Madagascar. And I have a quick one on the source of investment and source of funding in African countries. So we talked about ODA decreasing, but ODA, if I'm not mistaken, when you look at the flows, the proportion of flow that comes in African countries is not the biggest part. We have also, in terms of foreign funding sources, we have FDI, we also have remittances. So for me, the share of ODA decreasing is not really a challenge, it's an opportunity to tap into all those funding that is available. And I think that here the discourse needs to change for African countries. I'm yet to see an African country or another country in the world that has developed thanks to ODA. And in that, I really want to hear from the experience of India, what has been the share of ODA in funding, in public finance from India. And then my second point is about those commitments that African countries take. We have Maputo Declaration with 10% for agriculture, Abuja Declaration 15% for health, Global Partnership for Education 20% for education. If you only think about this, it's already 45% of national budget that is committed. For a Minister of Finance, you understand that this is completely impossible. We have most countries that spend at least 15% of their national budget paying or repaying debt. So African countries, they just commit for these things because they know that they are not going to meet any of those commitments. I think that it's time to stop about this commitment and really look into what is feasible, but also how it will translate into our people's lives. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Yes. And then we're quickly trotting across, and we have 10 minutes to conclude this session.
Thanks a lot, Rufus from the Embassy of Switzerland in Kenya. Mine is, again, following up on the issue of ODA. The question is more around the future of blended financing, because often enough, indeed, private sector cannot also be the magic wand, but especially when you're talking about investing in some of these very fragile contexts. So the part that development cooperation funding does bring is the de-risking for private sector, to be able to set up, to target, for instance, for forcibly displaced persons like refugees and IDPs. So maybe Julia or any other colleagues on the panel, what is the future in terms of blended finance? Thank you.
Okay. Wow, lots of hands up. You're right in front of me. Yes.
Thank you. Abla Abdelatif from Egypt. First of all, I want to congratulate you on the session because you've covered a huge spectrum of things, and the list of comments keeps on increasing, but I'm going to reduce it completely. First of all, I have a comment and a question. We do have a program in Egypt to deal with the rural areas and to improve the quality of life. It's called Decent Life. Okay, and I think such program can benefit significantly from the Nigerian experience and from the Indian experience, especially as far as two preconditions for any success are concerned, and that's the governance thing, the state's empowerment. Do you guys have an actual system for empowering the states? You can have great programs, great funding, but things don't get implemented on the ground because local type of control is not there. The question is, did you do impact assessment of these programs to isolate their effect? Because when people's life improve over time, okay, and to isolate that effect to the program is something that can be assessed with AI. My last point is related to AI and its effect on the job market. We're doing a lot of work of this on our side of town, on the Egyptian labor market, and AI is not going to make jobs disappear. What it is doing is affect certain skills in those jobs, and we need to be prepared, definitely, to deal with that. On the green skills, because it's becoming a very fashionable thing, I'm sure if you do the revoting with another definition, more people are going to raise their hand. All housewives have green skills, okay? So it's simply a new term. It is simply a new term about respecting the interests of the climate. Thank you.
Okay, let's get to this side of the room, and then I'll try to come back here. But first, let's cover this.
Okay, thanks everyone. Quite an insightful discussion. My question is around some of the points you've called out during the discussion. So firstly, when we look at most African countries, we've got a lot of cultural and religious beliefs, right? And you clearly mentioned it, Uzamaka. In Nigeria, the women in the Igbo states can't inherit properties. And my worry about that is when we are looking at accessing credit, when we are looking at promoting sustainable livelihoods, especially for the female gender, how can we address that? Then secondly, the gentleman over there touched on it. When we look at infrastructure, over 600 million Africans have no access to electricity. And when we look at a lot of African countries also, we see the fact that we've got poor road networks. And if we're looking at promoting sustainable livelihoods, how can we overcome that? So a farmer who is producing, say, oranges in the rural area is unable to get his produce to the city or complaints, right? Because the roads are bad. Before they get there, more than 50% of the produce is, spoiled. So those are two limitations that I think that would be good to get your thoughts on.
Sure. All right, this one, and this side of the room. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Veda Vaidyanathan from the Center for Social and Economic Progress, the think tank in Delhi. The last year, we've been partnering with the African Union Development Agency on creating a platform called the Africa-India Dialogue Series. And we've had folks talk about digital innovation, agriculture, creative arts, 10 different topics. One thing that's really come out through the dialogue series is platforming African experts and Indian experts, is that there are a lot of similarities in policy ecosystems and the challenges that we're facing in trying to make the most of the opportunities and so on. But the real challenge we've had is trying to find scholars or experts from across Africa who can speak to the Indian reality or inform the Indian reality, or from India who can actually speak to the African reality. So there seems to be acting in silos. There's a knowledge asymmetry. So when we're talking about India-Africa cooperation, how do we actually find platforms where we can actually exchange knowledge in a sustainable manner and really learn from each other? Thanks.
All right. I know that people at the back of the room have been trying to come in, so I'll let, yes. And maybe, yes. That can be our last comment, actually.
I'm so sorry, because I'm actually going to get a chance to speak later, but I just wanted to flag it in this particular meeting. I just wanted to say, pick up on one or two things that people were speaking about in relation to kind of digital divide and digital inequality. And I think just also in the context of the work that we've done within the G20, particularly around DPI, but also about the informal sector. And in the G20 context, SMEs and SMMEs all putting in one lump and dealing with innovation, when we know from our Africa surveys that most informal sector firms are not digitized. In that sense, they don't have access to the internet and they're not using it effectively. So I just wanted to flag within this context that the importance of digitization is a cross-cut across all the issues that were spoken, and I know many of you are speaking about specifically, but it's absolutely critical to address some of these economic issues we're facing. So the whole continental free trade area is not going to get going until we address the underlying digital problems. And in this regard, DPI is now being held up as a big, obviously, India import, but also a solution to many of us working in the region. So just to point out that there's this Pan-African initiative with the African Development Bank and the AU around the G20, reviewing DPIs, digital public infrastructures, for Africa, by Africa, because our conditions, while there are very many similarities, it's also very different. So if countries want to kind of be in touch on that initiative, there are a lot of opportunities to addressing some of these problems.
That is an excellent note to wind up this discussion. We've actually run out of time, and we do have the first plenary starting soon. We have, as Abla said, covered a lot of ground in this discussion, and for that I really want to thank all of our speakers. Absolutely excellent interventions. This is what we needed to build our work, and thank you to all of you for actively participating in this discussion. I'm going to hand over briefly to my colleague Shubh, who is Head of Partnerships at ORF, on why this discussion is important for us.
Thanks, Sunena, and thank you to all the speakers who joined us, and of course the room is also oversubscribed, so thank you so much everyone for taking out the time and joining us this early in the morning. As Sunena mentioned, we have run out of time. We'll have the first plenary session starting in 15 minutes. But before we leave, the reason we hosted this particular roundtable at Cape Town Conversation was because we at ORF are embarking on a very interesting project. We are looking at various programs that have been initiated by governments in India and different parts of Africa. As the descriptor of this roundtable suggests, India has launched something called the National Rural Livelihoods Mission. Ethiopia has something very similar, and other countries in Africa are also embarking on some of these policies. And the purpose of the project that we've embarked upon is, can we learn from each other? What is Ethiopia doing right, what it is doing wrong? What is India doing right, what is India doing wrong? Sharing these stories, sharing our experiences, sharing our learnings are very important as we progress towards the development goals that we've all sort of embarked upon in 2015. Goes without saying, it's unlikely we meet many of them, but this is a time, in fact, to now start thinking what happens beyond 2030. And some of these discussions and roundtables can infect ideas in the larger ecosystem when we are going to start negotiating beyond 2030, the next stage of development goals. What are they going to look like? Can we infect some of our ideas from the global south, from India, from Africa, into those frameworks so that the larger global community can benefit from them? Of course, the roundtable, as the descriptor suggests, mentions that can we look at sustainable livelihoods, particularly with an emphasis on women-led initiatives, leveraging technology. And as we, over the next 2 or 3 years, host more such convenings, host more such discussions, we will also amplify a lot of these conversations through research products. And we will be reaching out to many of you post this roundtable to start thinking, writing, researching, and contributing to ORFs. We'll publish your material on the ORF website. I'm sure Sunena will be in touch with you. And hopefully, over the next 2-3 years, as these conversations are hosted in different parts of the world, we can learn from all of you and the experiences of many of the global south countries in India, in Africa, and other parts of the world, and infect these ideas into the next phase of development. So once again, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us fairly early in the morning. I hope you enjoyed your breakfast here, and with that, we come to a close, and I invite you to join us in the adjoining room. Thank you once again.